here at the Walker Arts Center for a dialogue with director Todd Haynes. Tonight's program is titled Todd Haynes, 20 Years of Killer Films, in which I'll talk to Todd about his remarkable career and his 2-decade-long producing partnership with Christine Vachon of Killer Films. From his controversial feature debut, Poison, in 1991, through the Oscar-nominated Far From Heaven and I'm Not There, and his latest, Carol, Todd Haynes has filtered a half-century of the American experience through a formally inventive prism that has reimagined the AIDS crisis as a 1950s horror movie, suggested Oscar Wilde as the patron saint of glam rock, and studied the changing landscape of suburban American domesticity from the Depression-era 1930s of Mildred Pierce to the smog-choked 1980s Los Angeles of Safe. At every step, Haynes has shown himself to be a visionary stylist who is also a master storyteller and a brilliant actor's director. Indeed, that rare filmmaker who engages our mind and our heart with equal force. I'm Scott Foundas of Amazon Studios, and we'll now begin our dialogue with Todd Haynes. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with someone who I think deserves to be considered one of the real visionaries in American cinema, and to kind of take a trip down memory lane through your career. But I thought it would be interesting. I think a lot of people think of you as a New York independent filmmaker, although you did grow up in the scenic climes of the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, which informs very much Safe, which was, I think, the movie of yours that really broke you through to a somewhat wide audience. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your early days in the San Fernando Valley and how you first discovered your passion for cinema.
No one in my immediate family was in the industry, but my grandfather, who was a huge influence on my life and an amazing man, Arnold Semler, was a messenger at Warner Brothers in the 30s, worked his way up to becoming head of set construction by 1940 at Warner Brothers, left when the sort of blacklist climate got to be too much, and started his own business. And that was really our only direct lineage to the industry. But I grew up with kids and people who worked. We knew the Sherwood Schwartz lived on my do you know who that is?
Creator of Gilligan's Island.
Of Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch.
Yeah.
And we would go visit the Brady Bunch set, like most kids do, as you know.
This probably explains a lot, actually.
Right, it probably does. But I think, look, I was 3 years old when I saw my first film. It was Mary Poppins. And it had a profound, seismic, psychic effect on me that provoked some bizarre, obsessive creative response to that powerful synesthetic experience of seeing a movie. I'm sure the maternal subject in that film, the pyrotechnics of that unique Disney production, and the music, and so many elements of a pretty stellar kids film contributed. But something happened when I saw that film, and it would continue where certain movies, as I was a kid, would become points of obsession for me, and would generate this sort of obsessive creative response.
What were some other ones?
Romeo and Juliet, the Zeffirelli film in '68, was the next major obsession. I was 7. But that film, for people older than myself and probably people in my generation even, that film tapped into youth culture, counterculture at the time in a way that I remember vividly, that really felt like there was something very contemporary about this Shakespearean, tragedy. There was something erotic, obviously, about, Leonard Whiting's butt revealed in Olivia Hussey's bosom. And that played some factor in its impact. But then I think as I continued to grow up and mature, certain, not to undermine the directorial impact of Zeffirelli in that film, but like, films like The Graduate, which I saw when I was like 12 or 13, the sort of language of the camera, a directorial sort of a tourist, visual language, started to excite me. Like there was and I think it was partly about, something very continually revelatory about The Graduate is, and a lot of films from the late 60s, was a kind of minimalism of the frame, like a kind of reduction of information, and how powerfully, when you just held on Benjamin's face as he moves through the party and people's, women's bejeweled fingers would pull him one way or the other, and he would be pulled by the camera, but it was really what you didn't see that defined your imagination and propelled you through that narrative. That just started to excite me, and I think there was something visceral in the potential of what a director's craft could do. I continued to be interested in visual art and theater as I was a young person and moving toward college. But film, I think, was always there as something that would kind of encompass all of those interests.
And you went to Brown and you studied semiotics there, which I think also gets talked about a lot as having sort of formed your aesthetic in some way. But it's I think if people see now on the Criterion Blu-ray of Safe, this recently rediscovered short of yours that you made when you were, I guess, still in high school,
yeah.
The Suicide.
Yes.
So much of what we think of as a Todd Haynes movie is sort of already there in its infancy. It's kind of fascinating. But talk a little bit about the Brown experience and how that did kind of further your development as a storyteller, as a visual artist.
I mean, when I applied to Brown, I was just interested in finding where any kind of film production resided at the school. And in 79, 80, because I was waitlisted and I took a year off and traveled in Europe, came back and went to Brown, met Christine Vachon. The rest is history. But you needed to take a prerequisite course in semiotics to get to any kind of production courses, which were paltry at the time. They didn't have facilities, they didn't have anything. And semiotics, I would learn, was simply a program within the English department that had sort of a renegade status in the sort of academy of the Brown English department as it had existed for so many years, and resided in this sort of crumbling house, Adams House, on a small street off the sort of main campus. And everybody who took classes in semiotics wore black, and it was sort of like, it was like, what's the Audrey Hepburn film where everybody sort of parodies the Beats, and she's wearing black tights, and there's all these scenes in Greenwich Village.
Oh yeah, the Funny Face.
Funny Face, yeah. Thank you. It was almost like our own version of that. But the thing that was remarkable was that, and I'm oversimplifying. I had a really influential high school teacher, Chris Adam, who was a writer, and she knew Thomas Elsasser. She, in fact, dated Thomas Elsasser, and Thomas Elsasser is a sort of a scholar of German film, New German cinema, writes a lot on Fassbinder and the entire era, and he was the teacher of Marianne Doan, who has written extensively on the melodrama and women's films. And so I had this little inside tip when I went to Brown, because I knew Thomas. I met Thomas at the Atomic Cafe in downtown LA with Chris Adam one night before I went to college. And he said, yeah, my student Marianne Doan is now teaching at Brown. And so I was able to sort of skip the prerequisite courses at semiotics on the good name of Thomas Elsasser and go right into courses that seemed interesting to me. But I really didn't know what this meant. This was the product. Semiotics was sort of a loose term at the time, and for later it would become a department at Brown called Modern Culture and Media. But it was really really just talking about post-structuralist cultural theory and critical theory that was looking at art and culture from a sort of post-Freudian, post-Marxist, and as I would learn rather quickly, post-feminist or very feminist-informed academic discourse and filter. And at the time we were studying Laura Mulvey and those seminal articles about the male gaze and to be looked at-ness and all of those things. And now I look back and I realize, Jesus, I was in college in 1980. Laura Mulvey only wrote those articles in the mid-70s. I thought they were like predecessors from decades before, and now I realize how old I am. I'm like, we were just there right at, so this is a very new program, an academic program with a real, critical and political sort of radicality to it that was unique. And I think I found a kind of parallel language for questions I was already sort of asking myself about representation, about the nature of identity, the nature of gender, sexual orientation, and the nature of dominant practice within those sort of new questions that were being asked at the time. And so I was very lucky, and again, it was sort of somewhat serendipitous because I didn't really know what I was walking into. But it became a very, nourishing period of my life. And I left Brown thinking that I would be like experimental filmmakers who were teaching at Brown, like Leslie Thornton. I would be an experimental filmmaker, probably teaching in colleges, because the kind of films I would be interested in making would never find a market. And things changed when I moved to New York City, and events happened that I couldn't really have anticipated. But that was pretty much my mindset after Brown.
Well, you did make one film that for various legal reasons never really found a market, which is Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story. And this is kind of it's a really rich dovetailing of so many of your obsessions. It's a woman's picture. It's about the prison of suburban domestic life, and it's a pop music picture. Right. It's sort of everything. It's like the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, I kind of did it all then. I could have retired.
Did you, were you, when you were making the film, did you, and for people who don't know, although I suppose everybody does, made starring a cast of Barbie dolls and Ken dolls, did you think this film was destined to have some kind of commercial distribution, or did you sort of know the legal and other hurdles you were going to face when you were going into it?
No, Superstar was a private little art project that I embarked upon after graduating with a friend of mine who isn't a filmmaker, a dear friend, Cynthia Schneider. We wanted to maybe do a project together on film, and she wanted to do a film using pets, and I wanted to do a film using dolls. And I wanted to play out some questions about narrative form and the way that narrative form instructs our emotional engagement with storytelling, more than the fact that there was actually once a real actor on the other side of the lens, that it's more the conventions of storytelling that we as viewers fill in. And so I thought using dolls, but following a well-known convention, would demonstrate that to some degree. But I didn't know what it would be about, and Chris and Cynthia didn't have any idea what the Pets movie would be about either. So one day I was sitting in a coffee shop in New York City, and this was before they had like retro 70s stations on all the time, or 80s or 90s or 2000s as we have now. And a Carpenter song came on. And I was like, oh my God, I felt like I hadn't heard that music since I was 9 years old in 1970. The last moment I kind of shared perfectly the pop cultural, ideal with my parents, but so much had happened to Karen Carpenter since that music first appeared. She had died of anorexia. There was so many things that happened to the country and the world. There was Watergate. There was a lot had gone on. We were in the midst of the beginning, the sort of burgeoning AIDS crisis. And so that material seemed so rich and complex and seemed absolutely appropriate, of course, to be told with dolls because, well, it was so, you know, the whole issue, or one of many issues about anorexia is about, you know, how women see themselves and the kind of pressures from society about what ideal bodies are. And we've all heard the stories about the impossibly perfect body or the perversely perfect body of the Barbie doll. But also that we start telling our own stories as people with dolls and using dolls as surrogates for ourselves and conduits for emotion and desire. And so it just felt, you know, resonant on so many levels. But at the same time, that music, and I think this was the sort of the trick of Superstar, that music affected you against your better judgment. It was manipulative. It countered your intellect. You know, it won out in a way. And in a funny way, hearing that voice, which always seemed maybe a little precocious or pseudo deep or profound or something in its resonance, all of a sudden hearing her singing those songs after she had died, and we knew that there was so much more going on beneath the surface of that image of the Carpenters, gave new resonance to the music and also a way that the film could be read at different levels.
Well, it seems to me in a way that's maybe something that goes throughout your career, is this kind of mixing of what we might think of as sort of high culture and low culture, so that Poison, your first proper feature, has aspects of 1950s horror movies in one of the segments, and then it has aspects of kind of tawdry tabloid-style documentary in another segment. A movie like Velvet Goldmine is mixing everything from Richard Lester Beatles movies to Citizen Kane and its influences. Is that something that excites you, you know, to sort of to run the gamut of cultural possibilities within a single text?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think it's always been beginning to question the sort of system of dominant filmmaking from the perspective of a gay artist at a sort of critical political period culturally, when I was coming of age and starting to make work in New York City after college. But also knowing how much, you know, popular cinema and mainstream experiences and popular music and rock and roll, and, you know, how much all of those strands were running sort of concurrently, that there was a critical discourse, but then there was a popular discourse, and that there might be a way to bring them together and have one sort of speak to the other. And I guess also I felt that there was, I always felt, and I kept learning this from movie to movie, and it began with Superstar, that the spectator has these extraordinary powers of desire to enter a story and fill it in emotionally, you know, and to make it come alive. And really, the more I've made movies, the more I realize all of the emotion that we think the movie is giving us, we're actually giving the movie. And you have to give, as a filmmaker, I think I've learned that you need to respect that. Sometimes I've interrupted that process. I've set up boundaries to identifying with a character, as in my film Safe, which is about a woman who's very hard to find, locate. And, or, you know, Far From Heaven, there are many different examples of different sort of mediations to easy access to emotion or to identification. But I think what that often just keeps revealing is how much the spectator needs to be given that agency and sort of be encouraged to use their powers, which are unique. And sometimes movies overwhelm us with, you know, sensation and determination of how we're supposed to feel and what we're supposed to think, and you're left completely sort of lobotomized by the experience. What do I do? And you leave and you're like, okay. You don't even remember what you just experienced, you know? So that was always a motivation, I think, in a lot of the work.
Well, and Poison in particular feels like a film that wasn't just conceived as being against, let's say, the dominant or the mainstream system, but also against what was at the time, I guess you'd say, the new queer cinema, but many of the films were much more sort of genteel, or they were coming out stories, or they were AIDS stories, but very straightforward. Or, you know, movies like Longtime Companion or John Sayles' Liana, or these kind of movies. And Poison is not necessarily, you wouldn't say it's an angry film, but it's a confrontational film, and it's certainly a movie that wants to move the audience and even the gay audience outside of its comfort zone.
Yes, it was, but I would just abridge the question in that what was ultimately defined as the new queer cinema were films that sort of kind of followed Poison, or that were in the company of Poison and thereafter, and they were films like Tom Kalin's Swoon, like Greg Araki's The Living End, like Rose Turchet's Go Fish, films that were challenging formal and narrative strategies and conventions, as well as examining marginal lives and gay lives. And that was what made that term so meaningful to me, and actually something I never felt anything but pride to be associated with Derek Jarman. I mean, there'd been a long tradition of experimental and visionary filmmakers that preceded this moment as well, and Gus's films, and John Waters' films, and Couture Brothers, and on. Genet's own film, Enchant d'Amour, that informed this moment. But this moment was completely the result of a health crisis that was overtaking our lives and the way we looked at our relationship to dominant society and the status quo. But yes, Poison was confrontational, and it was, in many ways I felt like the gay community was sort of crouching under the and accepting some blame, accepting a kind of culpability for what was happening. And I felt that I wanted to sort of, create something that offered an alternative to that. And the best place to look for inspiration was the work of Genet. And of course, in my humble, modest American way, I was, adopting some cues from Genet and applying them to very American traditions of storytelling, and telling these three separate stories that almost told similar stories about outsiders and transgressive characters in society, and how they're cast and defined by the genres themselves. In a way, again, that asked the viewer to kind of compare and contrast different ways of telling the same story, and what those ways, the kind of burdens of prejudice and traditions of bias, or the way it positions you embedded in those genres.
And I'm thinking of the marvelous opening shot of a young boy's hand caressing all of the objects on his mother's bureau and in the drawers, and all you see is that hand under all the opening titles, and it's very much like what you were describing, the shot in The Graduate of Benjamin moving through the party. There's some kind of connection there.
Yeah, that's cool.
But back to the San Fernando Valley, back to Safe, which you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And this strange story of a woman who, as one character in the film suggests, is allergic to the 20th century. And maybe she's allergic to her new sofa, which seems to be about the biggest problem that she has in her life, this rather well-to-do Los Angeles housewife. Or maybe she's allergic to her life, and this is really it was a big step forward in terms of budget for you, in terms of audience size, and it was
going from $250,000 to $1 million.
And really, I think the first time a lot of us saw Julianne Moore.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's take a look at a little bit of Safe. Another woman called Carol, curiously.
That's exactly true.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't really talked lately. How you doing?
Good. I've just been a little...
Look, it's you.
Oh, yeah. Under the weather.
Right?
Look it, she's a princess.
Oh, that's very good. It's very realistic.
Ladies, we are now opening the big present. Please come in.
Okay, here we come.
Come on, Elise, let's go look at the big present, okay?
Yeah.
You thought he was?
Yeah. So have you seen? What did you see it? God, I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, you have to accept it.
God. This is fancy wrapping. It's too much.
Come on, don't be polite.
Oh, I'm trying. Stroller. Oh, God.
Right? Here, maybe we can get it on.
Oh, that's exactly the one I wanted. Oh.
There's a package with the wheels inside, and they go on really easily. You just screw them in. Even you can do it.
Great.
You see?
Powerful.
She's so polite. Atta girl.
Mommy? Oh, that's great. Well, I'm not going to watch it.
Well, right.
Carol?
But it can be
You all
done.
right?
Yeah, thank you.
Carol.
What's going on?
I don't know. Carol?
Oh my God, Linda, what happened?
She can't breathe.
Caroline, call her house. Someone should call her doctor. And Jennifer, could you get some water, please?
Just try to relax, okay? Calm down.
It's okay. It's all gonna be fine. Just relax. Just relax.
Hi. Of course, we're joined now by Christine Vachon, who put the killer in killer films. And I don't know if this was the first killer film or was just the first that with Todd to have that banner on it.
I don't think Killer has a credit on Safe. I think we did Poison together, and then we started planning Safe. And sometime, probably well after that, Killer really formed.
Okay. But you guys had actually known each other at Brown.
Sort of.
Talk a little bit about the origins of the partnership.
You know, we did know each other a little bit at Brown, but honestly, it was when we came to New York, both of us separately, you know, pursuing various, but you also have to remember New York at that time, it was a very exciting time, and there was a kind of mixture, very fervent mixture of music, art, cinema, fashion, like everything. We just called ourselves artists, and we came to New York and we were going to pursue the different things we wanted to do. Todd and I started working together at a company called Apparatus that was formed by somebody else we went to Brown with named Barry Ellsworth, and Todd was in the midst of making Superstar. So I had the great pleasure of working with him at the very end of Superstar, helping you get it through the post-production process, because I had interned for an editor, so I had all this experience that I could bring to bear. But I had a real epiphany when I saw the movie, and really realized that it was, I had been kind of trying to figure out, we were making films together already at Apparatus, that's what we were doing, but Todd wasn't directing those movies, we were helping other people make those films. But when I saw Superstar, I realized that that was it. This was the kind of movie I wanted to make. It was provocative, it was original, and it was incredibly entertaining. And I thought, like, I do not want to let him make another movie that I don't have my name on. And I think, you know, I mean, look, 25, 30 years ago, everything kind of, I remember saying to you, and it may not have gone this way, because I may have just like made this up. I remember saying to you, I want to produce your next film.
I remember.
And you were like, well, I think it should be an hour long. And I was like, no. We're not going to do this short thing anymore. We're going to do a feature film. That's what I remember. But
Apparatus was committed to making
short
shorts,
films.
Experimental narrative shorts,
Right.
helping emerging filmmakers
Exactly.
get resources.
And that was it. And we kind of went, you know, careening into Poison, which was kind of great because I don't think either of us had any idea how hard it would be. And
Well, you had the most experience. Christine had been working.
but I mean, I had not produced a feature film.
No, she'd not produced a feature film, but you'd been working in, I mean, you basically were teaching Barry and I what all the crew positions were, you know.
Because that's what makes a movie good.
Of course. But no, but really, you know, Poison was financed entirely by grants. It was financed by
And a
New
little
York.
bit by Sherwood Schwartz.
And a little bit by Sherwood Schwartz.
Which I was
It
going to
all
shout
comes
out.
back to
and my
Sherwood.
grandfather.
Which I was going to shout out when we were talking about
You're
it.
right. And the New York State Council for the Arts and the infamous
Absolutely.
$20,000 from
The
the
NEA.
NEA.
Right.
They
That's
got
how I
us-
first
they
found
got
out
us
about the movie,
in
because
trouble.
it was a national news story.
Exactly.
The Reverend Donald Wildman is
Yeah.
furious.
He's
that
still
the
with
NEA
us.
has funded this movie.
This gay porn film.
That's right.
basically.
I remember a headline from, you know, one of the conservative Washington paper. I can't remember what it's called now. It
The
said,
Times.
Washington Times.
The Washington Times. I needed to take a bath in Clorox.
They had a
After I
special
saw
screening for senators and their wives, and I was called the Fellini of Fellatio.
I think that's something you
Come on.
should own with pride.
I have a tattoo.
But it does come back to an interesting point, which is I think a number of these films that we're going to talk about tonight were actually kind of so ahead of their time that they weren't fully appreciated in their time. I would love for one of you to talk about what the reaction was the night that Safe premiered at the Sundance Film Festival.
Well,
I see who you're looking at.
I will talk about that. That was a rough night. I think people were a little dumbfounded. They weren't quite sure what to think. And I remember standing outside of the theater and seeing people come out. And I knew a lot of the critics by that point. I mean, it was only my, you know, maybe my fourth or fifth film at that point, if that. So it wasn't like I was super experienced, but I knew Kenny Turan, I knew, you know, whoever, Manola, whoever was reviewing at that time, and they wouldn't look at me. And I was like, oh God, you know, this didn't go well, this didn't go very well. And a few years later, most of those critics put the movie on their best film of the 90s list. So it had this total turnaround. But when Safe came out, people did not know what to make of it. They were like, well, if it's about AIDS, then it should be about AIDS. You know, like this is, you know, it's not right that it isn't about, you know, and people didn't seem to understand this incredible, you know, this incredible story that was timeless in my mind, and that, you know, was told so, I mean, just looking at that clip, I mean, how extraordinary was that clip, you know?
But even that year, I remember even within that first year, critics started to revisit Safe.
Absolutely.
And talk to other critics about it. And there became an internal discussion about the film, which I found to be sort of unusual.
And Julianne missed, like, New York Film Critics' Best Actress by, like, one vote. Like, she missed a lot of these. We thought the film was sort of like tumbling into relative obscurity.
Right.
But actually, as you just said, you're right. It was part of the discussion.
Something was forming around the film, which, you know, I have to say there have been three factors for the longevity of my career. Christine, seriously, because I would have given up trying to make safe. I mean, we tried to get the film financed for 2 years after Poison, which won the grand prize at Sundance Film Festival, and blah, blah, blah. And it was an impossible film to pitch or sell, about a woman who gets sicker and sicker and sicker and then gets sicker, and that's the end.
And you never know why.
And you never know why. And then she, you know.
And Todd was like, my biggest influence for this movie is John Dielman by Chantal Akerman.
Right. That just, you know.
And if they never heard of the movie, they were like, oh, that
okay.
3.5-hour
See
movie.
ya.
Right.
But it's been Christine. And Christine just kept going, no, we're gonna find the money, and we did finally. But that's been true in one degree or another on every film that I've made. But the critical community has been incredibly attentive to my work, and given it some of the time and space that some of the films have needed, I think, to be, you know, to be felt, or to be, not to say understood, but for them to sort of find their footing. And then ultimately, amazing actors who we were very lucky from the very beginning to attract, an extraordinary good fortune with this unbelievable artist who starred in Safe, who had never starred in a film before. She had been featured in Robert Altman's Shortcuts.
Which hadn't come out yet.
Which was just about to, or something. I forget the order. We saw it before it was released.
Just before we started shooting.
Right. And she would do Vachon on 42nd Street directly after Safe, and then the career just kept going. But, you know, that was somebody who was going to become a known entity, and hadn't quite yet, but read this script and just felt she knew exactly what to do with this almost unimaginably unplayable character.
Yeah, we
and
should
she did.
mention that another great little bonus on the new Blu-ray is the audition footage of Julianne reading for the part, which is really terrific, and people should check that out if they are curious. But, so this movie cost 4 times what Poison did, and I think your next movie cost about 10 times what this movie cost, right?
No,
Gold Mine?
7 million.
Maybe 7.
Okay.
Yeah.
So an even bigger step up.
Right.
And a hugely audacious film, deconstruction of the mythos of David Bowie through a fictional avatar, a movie with a lot of other people like Julianne Moore who were about to explode, but hadn't quite yet at that moment. Christian Bale, Ewan McGregor, Toni Collette, all of whom we'll see in a second. And actually, let's take a look at a little bit of the movie and then talk about it some more. But I'm glad to know this is a movie that has belatedly sort of found its audience. The story of a rock star known as Brian Slade, a.k.a. Maxwell Demon.
Baby Rocket, and we have a very special show for you today, dedicated to one of pop's amazing new talents, and one who has been holding a virtual reign over the British chart for a startling record-breaking 18 months. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the incomparable Brian Slade, or should I say, Maxwell Demon.
Bloke at the front.
Brian, why the makeup?
Why? Because rock and roll's a prostitute. It should be tarted up, performed. The music is the mask, while I, in my chiffon and taff, well, part of the message.
Bloke in the suit, yeah. What about your fans? Aren't they likely to get the wrong impression?
And which wrong impression is that?
Well, you're a blinking fruit.
Well, thank you, sir, and no. It doesn't concern me in the least. I should think that if people were to get the wrong impression of me, the one to which you so eloquently referred, it wouldn't be the wrong impression in the slightest.
That is me! That's me! That's me!
I mean, everybody knows most people are bisexual.
Any more questions?
I was...
Yeah, woman with the beret.
I was under the impression that you were married and living in North London.
I am married. Quite happily, in fact. I just happen to like boys as much as I like girls, and seeing as my wife feels pretty much the same about such things, I should think we've been able to make a fairly decent go of it so far.
All right. Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much.
For the first time in Brian's life, he was simply telling it like it was. Did he realize what he'd actually done? How could he have? I mean, today, there'd be fighting in the streets. But in 1972, it was more like dancing.
There's somebody credited with the co-story on this movie. It was a very important collaborator of yours on all of your films through Far From Heaven, which is Jim Lyons.
Yeah.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that creative partnership.
Yes, Jim was my partner in life for 7 years. He stars in Poison. He was a reluctant actor until
very good in the movie
until after Poison, and then he was an
unreluctant actor.
But he was a brilliant editor, and that was always his ambition. And he was a brilliant guy. He was just an amazing guy, and he just worked so incredibly hard at everything that he did. And he had this. We were celebrating Poison on a trip one time, and he said he had this idea about doing a film about how homosexuality gets sort of utilized by dominant society in these various ways, and it would be a 3-part film. One would be about the church, one would be about the military, and one would be about glitter rock. And I said, hold on, right there. I mean, it was a brilliant idea as a thesis, but I just said, oh my God, a movie about glam rock. What an amazing opportunity. Because, you know, there's amazing, many chapters in the history of rock and roll and the history of popular music. They don't all need to be told on film. But this one being such an extraordinarily visual, you know, moment in the sort of, you know, annals of rock and roll, but that's just the very beginning of what narrative potential, what potential about sort of telling a mini story of the history of queer art, you know, and underground art, queer art, and the ways that all of those things intersected at various unexpected moments in cultural history. Sort of the way you were describing the New York that we walked into.
Right.
Nothing was more true about that by the end of the 1960s, where rock and roll culture, fine art culture, underground culture, criminal, you know, cultures all sort of coexisted and created unexpected results. And glam rock was almost like an accidental blip on the sort of radar of cultural life that all of a sudden made, you know, bisexuality and androgyny the mode, you know, the dominant mode. And it was just an amazing piece of material. And because David Bowie was already fictionalizing himself, even David Bowie was an adopted name, but Ziggy Stardust and Iggy Pop and all of these characters that these people were propagating and creating narratives and subtext and theatrical narratives that they would play out musically on stage, it became, and even the way David Bowie became a star was an artificial sort of Warholian process, literally using second-generation Warhol actors to become the company of Main Man Studios and construct him as a star in the United States before he was one by performing stardom. You know, the whole thing was just completely brilliant and artificial, and could only have happened at that transitional moment from grassroots rock and roll culture to what would become a massive industry of rock and roll by the mid-70s. At this intersection, it was exploitable, and they exploited it in the most brilliant way. So that was some of the ideas behind Velvet Goldmine. With
Bowie, you were shut out, I guess, more or less.
Yes.
Did he ever come back around after the film had come out? No.
No, but weirdly enough, because we're, you know, in the world that we're in, I come into contact with his managers or his, you know, they said, oh, you know, we just No, we were interested. They totally weren't.
Such a lie.
We just, we were waiting for you to come back to us with a proposal, which was completely so not true. Because, we were so in the trenches of trying to convince them to let us at least use, a few songs. But I think they've rewritten history a little bit, that like somehow, they wouldn't.
You guys dropped the ball.
It was a timing problem.
Right, exactly.
As a result, there were 7 David Bowie songs that the script was sort of conceived around as a template. And when they were removed, it created all of this opportunity. And they were filled with far lesser known and really amazing songs.
And some original.
And some original songs, many original. The whole soundtrack is a
Right.
combination, but those specific Bowie songs were pretty much replaced by Roxy Music songs, Brian Eno songs, Steve Harley Cockney Rebel songs, who's very little known in the United States. And that, in the language of the film, which was creating a parallel universe anyway.
So before we talk about Far From Heaven, talk a little bit about the time between those two movies, because Velvet Goldmine was a big commercial failure at the time, and talk about how that affected you and what happened and where Far From Heaven then sort of comes into the narrative of your career.
Well, let me just say one thing about the big commercial failure part. It wasn't a commercial hit, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a big commercial failure. It didn't cost that much money. But the thing that happened with Velvet Goldmine, which was very new to both of us, was it kind of took off and had an internet life.
Yeah.
The internet was relatively new in everyone's life.
We knew about this because of the Christian Bale phenomenon.
Right.
Because of Newsies. Right? The generation of Newsies was the new generation of the internet.
Absolutely.
And they were tracking Christian Bale's every move. And we kind of knew this, and we were telling, who.
But
that,
nobody,
no one really
no one knew
weren't
how
up,
to tap into
weren't
that.
up on it. But what, all of a sudden, there was this thing called slash fiction, and we were getting these narratives sent to us. Well, they were online. Well, there are all these websites propping up, these obsessive Velvet Goldmine.
There were at least 20.
Right, and they would be the best XXX rated story. For people who don't know what slash fiction is, it's imaginary. It's almost always gay, and often it's like taking scenes from Star Trek and conceiving gay scenarios that fans construct, and not just boys, but girls.
Right.
And we found
almost more girls.
More girls. And we found that with Velvet Goldmine, the teenage female following for the film was the thing that distinguished it the most. And it continues to be the case today. Whenever I do talks, I see women coming up to me of a certain age or with sort of tattoos or some diet, and I'm like, they're here for Velvet Goldmine. I know it, and they have the Velvet Goldmine thing they want me to sign. But we were getting all these crazy stories, XXX versions of Velvet Goldmine, the best one of the week, softcore porn versions, all the way down the spectrum.
And websites that literally analyzed every single line and scene. And I remember calling Todd at one point going like, there's this thing. And he had an internet following already that was kind of eggheady, that was following like Poison and Safe, and they were like, this is the reference to Lacan. And the Velvet Goldmine stuff had nothing to do with Todd. They didn't care who Todd was. It was just like, it was about the movie.
But they were getting to know who Oscar Wilde was.
Absolutely.
Anyway, it was just, they were learning about this subculture, this underground sort of queer history. And they were young people. And it was the kind of movie that we had growing up as teenagers. Coming out of rock and roll culture, that I would be obsessed with. The Ken Russell movies of the 70s, or Performance by Nicholas Roeg. Movies I just would watch over and over again and analyze with my friends and and I was like, I want to make a movie like that for young people, and that really is what Velvet Goldmine became.
I think, Christine, though, and not to emphasize the commercial failure, because I love this movie, and it's probably turned a profit by now because it's been rediscovered.
Right.
But I think in your book you say Todd kind of retreated to a cabin in the woods after that movie came out.
Oh yeah, it wasn't because of Velvet Goldmine. I was thrilled with I was so proud of Velvet Goldmine. It was love life.
I don't think either of us were like at that point. We were fairly like we got it made.
Yeah,
that was the success.
I was just so happy it was over. It was a really tough shoot, but it wasn't. But no, I was proud of the movie. I did retreat, but it was for all kinds of other reasons. And I left New York, and I needed a different place to be, and I didn't even really know that I needed a different place to be. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to, I want to do something for Julianne. I'm going to do something with Cirque and do a melodrama. And I conceived of a plot, and I decided I'd get away from the city, where I'd lived for 15 years, and visit my sister in Portland, Oregon, and write Far From Heaven, what would become Far From Heaven. But for some weird reason, at this time, I started to, I listened to Bob Dylan when I was in high school, but I hadn't really continued staying on top of Dylan, and he continued to put out records every year for all those years. And for some reason, I just started craving Dylan, and I wasn't. It was this insatiable appetite that of course there's so much material to satisfy, and this was the beginning of the releasing of all the bootleg material, and the first 3-disc bootleg series was out, and I bought it on my drive to Portland from New York, and it just blew my mind. I was also reading all these biographies about Dylan for the first time. And I sort of, while writing Far From Heaven, I was obsessing about Dylan, and I came up with this idea about how to approach him as a subject. And I don't know if you want to take a break and watch that now.
Let's look first at Far From Heaven.
Far From Heaven, okay, good.
Which I'm sure most people are familiar with, but it's, of course, Julianne Moore as a housewife who has a romance with her black gardener.
Yes, Jake.
There's a lady on the phone for you.
I'll be right there. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for meeting me. I realize you have a busy schedule.
Worked out fine. I was glad you called. Are you sure everything's all right?
Is there something I can do for you folks?
Can we leave here?
Of course. What is it? What happened?
I wanted to see you in person, Raymond. I can't.
Can't what?
It isn't plausible for me to be friends with you. You've been so very kind to me, and I've been perfectly reckless and foolish in return, thinking...
Thinking what? That one person could reach out to another? Take an interest in another? That maybe for one fleeting instant could manage to see beyond the surface? Beyond the color of things?
Do you think we ever really do? See beyond those things? The surface of things?
Just beyond the fall of grace. Behold that ever-shining place. Yes, I do. I don't really have a choice.
I mean, I could have easily asked this about the clip we saw from Safe, or probably any of the clips that we're going to see, but to the best you can articulate it, I think one of the things that is so special about these films is that we see all of your influences from the avant-garde, from the kinds of philosophers and critics that you mentioned having studied. We see all of that, and yet, unlike a lot of avant-garde cinema, there is this intense emotional engagement also. And even if you've deliberately tried to put this distance in, as you've said, you know, we still connect with these films on a storytelling level, on a human level, and there's this very intriguing balance in the movies between this intellectual rigor and then all of these more, let's say, classical elements of narrative storytelling. And I don't know, you know, how much you can talk about like where you find that balance in the writing, in the shooting, in the cutting room, and how important that is for these movies to work.
No, I mean, I love movies from the inside out, you know. So the inside is the part that I pay very close attention to when I'm making them and thinking about them. It's hard for me to watch a clip like that and not think of Elmer Bernstein's score. This was the last film Elmer Bernstein composed for, and he was just you know, I'm just so lucky that I got to work with him. He was just one of the most amazing people. And this meant so much to him, this film. And he'd never, you know, for all of the genres that he had composed for, everything from crazy comedies in the 80s to the classic films that define him.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
To Kill a Mockingbird and the jazz scores from the 50s that first launched his career. He'd never really done a melodrama. And I think, you know, because he came from a cool sort of Marxist, you know, New York City perspective at the beginning, and I think they were derided. They weren't really taken seriously. And they were a later category of films that were given serious attention by the, you know, the cahiers writers and so forth. Yeah, they need, in many ways, I followed Cirque very, very closely with Far From Heaven, but that classic Circean ending, that idea that's the false happy ending that leaves you sort of unsettled and you don't trust it, I deviated from in Far From Heaven.
You gave us the classical tragic ending.
It's a really sad ending.
Yeah.
And in many ways, Safe is a more Circean, that's a false happy ending that follows the sort of codes of the narrative, but you're like, wait a minute, something's wrong here.
I also want to ask about the incredible surfaces and textures in these films. I'm just looking at that again, the placemats on the counter in the restaurant, the little sign on the cash register, which is a very important sort of story beat too. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone.
Right.
That detail work is always so intense. I mean, we could think about that living room we were looking at in Safe. Can you sort of talk about these kind of elements of design, of costuming, of props as being more than just set dressing, as being sort of very living elements of the narrative?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly Cirque gives you that as an opportunity if you're using him as an example of what decor and mise en scène and lighting and costume can do to undermine narrative or to speak on its own separately or parallel to the story. But somebody asked me today, I get asked a lot about why do I always make these period films? And I think, you know, among many reasons, that maybe some of which are just simply selfish, that I learn so much about the world and about the past and about history when I do. It also means that every element is something you have to consider. Nothing can be taken for granted. Every car, every cash tray, and so that's important to me because I think, you know, everything should be considered whether you're making a period film or not. And all of those elements are meaningful. And I think when you're forced to think about them, then you make choices that you're cognizant of and you're aware of, and they often have cost considerations and everything else. The amazing thing, the really funny thing about Cirque is when we were doing, as opposed to Carol, which is a very different 1950s film, very differently styled and conceived, you know, the whole Circean universe is an artificial universe. And so it meant that everyone's practice, everybody on set, The way the prop person would want to, after the party scene, have ashtrays with cigarette butts burnt out and debris, and I'd be like, no, it has to be absolutely immaculate. It doesn't look like real life. There's
Right.
something unreal and oppressive about these environments and these, interiors. And that says so much about what's so hard about living under these circumstances as the characters suffer.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to look at Carol right after this, actually, and especially because we're short on time.
Right.
I'll explain to the audience that Todd, like Elvis, has to leave the building at the stroke of 8 to catch an airplane. So we'll look at, I think a lot of people saw Carol last night, but I think it'll be instructive to kind of see this juxtaposition of these two 50s melodramas, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But this is, I love this scene, and again, it's a wonderful combination of all the things that you excel at, the great acting, the beautiful surfaces, and all of these unspoken things that take place between the lines. And this is the first real encounter between Carol and Therese when they go to lunch after she's returned her gloves in the mail in Carol.
Cheers.
Cheers. So I'm sure you thought it was a man who sent you back your gloves.
I did. Thought it might have been a man in the ski department.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm delighted. I doubt very much I would have gone to lunch with him.
Oh, your perfume.
Yes.
It's nice.
Thank you. Harge bought me a bottle years ago, before we were married, and I've been wearing it ever since.
Harge is your husband?
Mm-hmm. Well, technically, we're divorcing.
I'm sorry.
Don't be. And do you live alone, Therese Balavette?
I do. Well, there's Richard. He'd like to live with me. Oh, no, it's nothing like that. I mean, he'd like to marry me.
I see. And would you like to marry him?
Well, I barely even know what to order for lunch.
And your muse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
I'm starved. Bon appetit. What do you do on Sundays?
Nothing in particular. What do you do?
Oh, nothing lately. I mean, if you'd like to come visit me sometime, you're welcome to. At least there's some pretty country around where I live. Would you like to come visit me this Sunday?
Yes.
What a strange girl you are.
Why?
Flung out of space.
This is a seduction scene in which no one touches each other.
Yes.
Before we turn it over to the audience, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to talk a little bit about your long collaboration now with the cinematographer Ed Lachman, whose work is just particularly luminous on this film, and just sort of how you discuss what the look of a film is going to be, and what kind of references, cinematic and otherwise, go into planning a film, maybe using Carol as an example.
Oh, each one is so different and unique and in depth. With Carol, and I usually begin, like many directors, with an image book that I put together and draw from references to films or whatever is germane to the project and meaningful. And often that is a lot about cinema. That was true for Far From Heaven, that was true for I'm Not There, it was true for Mildred Pierce. In the case of Carol, it was a little less the case, less true. I was looking almost more at photojournalism and art photography from the early 50s when this takes place, and found that the culture, the American life, particularly in New York City, or the images that at least I was seeing in the research, depicted a very, very different world than we think of as the 50s, you know, the Eisenhower era that's much more depicted and relevant to Far From Heaven. This is this, you know, period really still crawling out of the post-war years, where there's a great deal of uncertainty and a distress, sort of fatigue that you see in the images of New York at the time, a dirtiness, a sort of sordid, you know, soiled color palette that both Ed and I really responded to. And the work, as I was talking about a little bit last night in the Q&A after Carol, the work of Saul Leiter, we can't, you know, overstate as an influence. And it's so extraordinary and such beautiful color photography from this mid-century New York-based photographer and abstract expressionist painter. But we also saw a lot of work by female photographers that were being published in Life magazine and who were working in color. And the color process itself brought a different kind of palette to anything that we'd done quite before, and that is reflected in the look of it. But so it begins with the book and these references and trying to really do something distinct, I think, each time. And so there's all of these shots through, which you don't really see in this clip, but a lot of shots through glass and reflections and windows, and where this almost the lens itself, the act of looking, is foregrounded, because it's all about desire and who's on what side of that looking.
Like in the last scene in the restaurant.
Oh yeah, yes.
Questions for Todd Haynes and or Christine Vachon, though Christine will stay with us
say they should be
a little
for
bit
Todd.
longer after Todd leaves, so maybe we'll start just with questions for Todd.
Hi, Todd.
Hi.
Hi, Christine. I am a big fan of your work, and it's been very influential to me. What I would love to hear from you is for you to talk a little bit about my favorite thing you've ever done, which is Dottie Gets Spanked. And it's a movie that connected to me so much as a gay man of a certain age. And I think that every gay man should watch that film, because it's like the most accurate portrayal of growing up with the stigma of a homosexual desire, that I think it's like the most beautifully, artfully film about that I've ever seen. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Dottie Gets Spanked was a short film that we made for public television. For
ITVS.
ITVS, a series where they asked independent filmmakers to do half-hour or hour-long pieces based on the family and television. And I had recently been home and went through a lot of childhood artwork of mine and found all of these drawings that I did as a kid, and they were all depicted my obsession with Lucille Ball, and of course, and you know, all these other women, basically. Cinderella, you know, kind of a weird hybrid of real life people on TV and fairy tale subjects. I remember a little friend of mine who was a girl at the time, who said, "Are you bad at men?" I guess I was bad at men.
Probably also told you you were a feminino.
She probably, yeah, which is a classic moment in Dottie. But it inspired this film. I was really interested in Lucy, and I did get to meet Lucy as a little LA kid and visited her set, like little Stephen Gale in the movie, and gave her a little book of my drawings when I was 7 or something, and she was like, "Yeah, thanks, baby." You know, but it is a very it's in some ways a more personal film for the very reasons that you talk about, and comes from a lot of my own personal memories.
So you're talking that as being a personal film, and I have to go back to Velvet Goldmine, because that seems to me.
Speaking. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hey. It seems to me to almost be autobiographical in a sense, like to have taken that story and twisted around and told it in a way that is almost more true than a documentary by taking those pieces and shattering them. And I love that you didn't get those Bowie songs, because by bringing in sort of the more peripheral music, you kind of evoke the era better. So was that actually your experience? Did you sort of grow up with glam and see those bands at Rodney's and all that stuff in LA, or did you actually recreate that?
I wish I was. I wish I was Christian Bale in that movie. I was a little, in the United States, it wasn't as mainstream a phenomenon for kids out my age as it was in the UK. And kids a little older than me were on to Bowie. Bowie freaked me out when I was, he scared the shit out of me when I was, in 7th and 8th grade. Those record covers were just too uncanny. But there was something in them that I knew I was going to be returning to, that you sort of, almost the way Stephen Gale in Dottie Gets Spanked takes that picture of the spanking, folds it up and buries it into his backyard for later in his life when he can deal with that. That's sort of how I felt about Bowie at the time. But what I loved about glam rock and glitter rock is that it endowed the fans, sort of what I was saying in some ways about audiences and spectators. It endowed the fan with this active role in participating in the music and in dressing up and becoming one with these characters that were being portrayed. It's why Rocky Horror Picture Show had that enduring life, because it asked you to take part in the ritual. And it was a ritual of transvestism and drag and androgyny, and it was a ritual of throwing off notions of secure identity, that teenagers know better than anybody else that identity is not secure, that sexual identity and gender identity and all those things are unstable. And so this moment in rock and roll celebrated that and made that the rule. And so that's what endows Christian Bale's character, Arthur, with all of that agency and gave him that sort of access into his own participating in his own fantasies, literally in the story.
Yes, in the blue jacket there.
A while back in 1991 or 1992, I was a student at Brown University, and I actually got a chance to see you speak, do a Q&A in a lecture hall just after showing a screening of Poisoned. And one thing that I distinctly remember about that Q&A is that two of the ideas that you talked about later turned out to be films of yours. One, Gulf War syndrome seemed to be a thing at the time. And you had said something about how people were paying attention to Gulf War syndrome because the victims were male. And it seemed, after Safe came out years later, I was like, wow, okay. And then you also said that you had this interest in glam rock and interest in doing a glam rock film, and that became Velvet Goldmine. So obviously those two things were on your mind at the same time, and I guess what I'm curious about is why you would do Safe before Velvet Goldmine, because it seems like that's not exactly the path of least resistance. I mean, it's admirable, but not exactly easy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't remember having been talking about the glam movie that early, but I, it's funny how all these things are sort of brewing at the same time. Safe was still very much, although I decided to set the conflict about as far outside what I considered the war zone of HIV as I could conceive in suburban Los Angeles and in this sort of guise of 20th century illness. But it was still very much a film that was trying to engage with issues of illness, issues of culpability, issues of recovery that were in discussion at the time. And particularly, this phenomenon that was brewing with some new age recourses that people were taking toward notions of recovery, trying to gain any sense of ownership or control over this devastating condition. There were sort of spiritual leaders like Louise Hay and writers who would say to sufferers of HIV and AIDS that if you learned how to love yourself, you could get rid of your AIDS. So it was this horribly complex double, bind that was people would. But what interested me more than the fact that there were people like Louise Hay out there was that there were so many sufferers of illness, of HIV, who wanted that, who felt that, and it was like, yes, give me something that I can control in this uncontrollable situation. And there was a quote by a cancer sufferer that I found around the time that said, "We humans would rather accept culpability than chaos." And I just thought that was so apt, that we'd rather blame ourselves and feel that we're at fault than deal with circumstances that we can't control. And that was where this whole final act of safe resides in this world. But yeah, it was definitely, I think it was because I was so immersed, we were all so immersed in that epidemic and in activism around that epidemic and in a whole series of discussions about illness and what illness means and how it gets interpreted and applied.
Hi. I would like to hear about your approach with working with your actors and how that's changed over the years. Watching a film like Far From Heaven and then Carol, which are set in very similar periods, and dealing with these themes, these kind of the themes of like the culture at the time, but yet the acting styles are so different between those films. Would you just talk a bit about your approach with preparing to work with your actors and just some maybe specific examples of being on set?
Sure. Well, those acting styles are quite consciously extremely different and conceived as such. And something so interesting that Julianne said at the time, because the language of Far From Heaven was such a kind of artificial language that came out of traditions of film, traditions of the melodrama. That and contrary to what that scene seems to be saying that we showed the clip from, that what's beneath the surface is what is true. What's so interesting about these films is that everything is true. Everything that's on the surface is true, and the surface reveals everything. And Julianne once said something to me about how the language is so exposed that she found it actually very easy to play. A lot of actors would bristle against the artifice of that language, the fact that it doesn't sound like real speech. But she felt that there was actually something completely available to her in that, which is so interesting. But she's such a dexterous and versatile actor, as is Cate Blanchett, as is Christian Bale, as so many of these people I've been lucky enough to work with.
Stock company.
I know, right? God. And really, all I've learned as a director, and I learned this early on, is that every actor is different. Every actor has a slightly different way of speaking and preparing for what they do. And really, it just takes a sort of flexibility and sensitivity each time to be as open to each of them and to, some actors like to prepare and talk it all out, and some actors really don't. And in all cases, they're doing something that's preparing themselves for and protecting themselves, I think, from something that happens in front of the camera. And some of them like to do that with a lot of input, and some of them like to do that with no input whatsoever. And so it's really about respecting that process and knowing that it's going to be different from case to case.
Todd Haynes, sorry you have to leave us because it's been an incredible
really nice.
pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you.
See you in a couple days.
Bye.
Would you like to join in the hot seat now, Vicky? And before I take some questions from the audience for you, we should just say that, of course, you could rest on your laurels had you only produced Todd's films, but in addition, there are a few little movies in the 95 or so that you've done with titles like Hedwig and the Angry Inch, Kids, Boys Don't Cry. I could go on. And I was thinking when Todd was talking about sort of his sort of project as a director, the kinds of movies he wanted to make that were against these established codes of the mainstream, it sounded almost like he was describing the killer films catalog as well. But at the same time, I think, you know, rarely have you made a movie, if ever, that was only about being controversial or having some kind of hot topic or transgressive content. There's always, like in Todd's films, this intense level of emotional engagement, of richly drawn characters. And to the best that you can do, could you talk about what is a killer film or what kind of material attracts you as a producer?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, you know, I know it doesn't seem obvious from the body of work, but we have to make commercial films. And what makes a movie commercial is really very specific. It makes its money back. So it returns to the investors. So you can make a movie that's out there and crazy and for a very tiny audience, but if you make it for the right amount of money, it's a commercial film. So, so one of the big things that I have to think about when I'm making a film, when I'm deciding to get behind a movie, is I have to think about its makeability. And its makeability isn't just like, how do I go out there and actually craft it? That's way down the line. It's, will I get it financed and why? Like what, like, take a movie like Still Alice, for example, which, you know, we made we made it and got it out there so quickly. It's hard for me to believe that it was like, you know, just last year. But that movie, you know, when you're sort of tabulating what makes it makeable, you know, on the one hand, it was a best-selling novel. It was. Julianne Moore, fantastic. But two directors who really, you know, hadn't had a hit for a very long time. And a subject that was just a bummer. And the only way that movie was going to make it was on that performance. That Julianne was going to have to deliver that career-defining performance. And that was what all the bets were on. You know, that movie would only be commercially successful, really, if she could pull that off. And she did, obviously.
I mean, it is interesting to hear you, you know, speak in those terms, because I think, again, to the outside, you know, you look like the backer of very, you know, radical risk-taking material, which it is.
I am.
But it has to be done within these certain parameters. And a story that you recount in your book, A Killer Life, that I think is very intriguing, is about Boys Don't Cry, and about the fact that at one time there was this sort of unwieldy 4-hour-long director's cut.
Maybe it was 3.5, but it was long. That might have been some hyperbole on my part.
And this was really where you kind of had to step in as the producer and find a way to, I guess again the word would be commercial, to make a commercial version of this movie.
I mean, the thing about Boys Don't Cry, which I assume most of you have seen, right? Although it's old now, it's crazy. It's like it's a 16-year-old film. Boys Don't Cry, it spent like a year and a half in the editing room, and the crazy thing is that 3.5 hour cut played. And we did a lot of screenings, and people had an extraordinary experience watching that cut. And that was really tough for me and for Kimberly, because, you know, it was an emotional experience, but I knew, and she came to understand, that that wasn't the version of the movie that was going to have any kind of real commercial success. And at a certain point, I think we both started to realize, like, this movie had that potential, you know, that it really could speak to people that way, but not at 3.5 hours. And then it got down to like 2.5 hours. I mean, I am telling the exaggerated version of the story. We finally had a version of the movie that was probably about a half hour too long. And that also, again, played really well, you know? So, but, you know, we knew that was like the super, super art house version of the movie, and that the 2-hour version was the, you know, potentially going to the Oscars version.
What is the hardest part of your job?
Oh, so much of it is so hard. I mean, I don't know. I'm like, how long do you got? You know, look, the hardest part is probably just convincing. Getting a movie greenlit is like threading a needle in a snowstorm. You really just, you have to have like, you know, everything has to line up exactly. And then suddenly it's like, whoosh, here we go, you know? And that's just, every time it happens, I'm like, how did we just do that? But that's probably the hardest part, just getting them to happen. And then the second hardest part is actually making them, because that's awful. And production is just awful. We're in production on a movie right now, and I'm so glad I'm not there. I'm just like, I call the set, I'm like, what? And they're like, oh, and then we didn't shoot, you know, and Michelle's still in makeup, and I'm just like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not there. And then getting them out into the world, and that, I mean, look, Carol was hard to finance and it was hard to make. And right now, we're on the precipice. I don't know what's gonna happen. You know, is that movie gonna go full throttle awards? Is it gonna be a almost ran? Is it gonna be a like didn't really get in the running at all? I have no way of knowing, none of us do. And making a movie that actually manages to check all those boxes, the critics like it, the public likes it, and they actually go to see it. I mean, that just happens a few times in your lifetime.
And this is your and Todd together, your third trip to the ball with Harvey Weinstein as your distributor,
for us together, yes.
Yeah, storied figure in the American independent landscape.
Right.
Can you talk about the evolution of the Todd Haynes, Christine Vachon, Harvey Weinstein partnership?
No, I can't talk about that. Why? I mean...
Well, I would just say it seems to be a story with a happy ending.
Well, exactly.
Carol
no, it is
going
Honestly,
into the award
look,
season as a kind of flagship movie.
As you so lovingly pointed out, Velvet Goldmine, our commercial failure, was our first experience with which was then Miramax. But you know, whatever, that happened. And I will still argue to my death that it wasn't actually a commercial failure, but whatever. But actually, I'm Not There was a pretty great experience with the Weinstein Co. I mean, that was a crazy movie, and I don't know if Harvey totally got it, but he sort of got its potential. And it actually did quite well. And I think that it was in really good hands. Mm-hmm. Carol feels like we finally managed to find the movie that is in perfect sync, and you know, look, Harvey loves it. It's exactly the movie Todd wanted to make, and look, I hope that we're all riding off into the sunset together. But again, as I say,
no one knows.
No one knows. I don't count chickens, you know. I mean, how many Academy members are in this room?
Ah, then what are we even doing here?
Why am I here?
Questions for Christine Vachon from the non-Academy audience. We'll start in the back. The woman has her hand up there. Yes.
Don't you think that cutting something like Boys Don't Cry down from 3.5 hours to 2.5 hours gets a lot of people to watch it who would never be exposed to something like that? And I think film is something that...
Well, I mean, that's why we did it. Of course I think that.
So do you have any, I mean, as a producer, that's exactly the line you're walking all the time, isn't it? Do you want to speak any further on what it's like for you to try to convince your artists and then convince the people giving you money and back and forth at all?
I mean, that is absolutely, you've kind of completely captured it. That is what I do, is try to figure out how to make the most, now when I say the most commercial version, you guys might be like, oh, commercial. But what I mean is the version that the most people will want to see. You know, I mean, even like taking Carol, you know, I don't know if Carol would work as well as it does if it didn't have two bona fide movie stars. Like, they are real movie stars, and you want to see, like, you want to see them, you want to be in their world. So would that have worked with actors who maybe would have been just as good, you know, but wouldn't have had that kind of like, boom, you know? There's this whole, like, you know, the cast and how you work with it and what that, you know, what movies need that kind of star turn and what movies can get away. I mean, to go back to Boys Don't Cry, Hilary Swank was literally nobody when we cast her in that film. And she'd done an arc on 90210, and she had been in The Karate Kid 3.
That was a star turn.
Okay.
That was a star turn.
There you go. So, but our argument to the financiers was she has to be unknown, because if the audience knows who she is, they're going to bring baggage, and it has to really be, the audience has to be in the same position as the people in the town. Like, a stranger comes to town, who the fuck is this, you know? That's what it has to be. And that was a very important creative point that obviously really paid off. And now, of course, it's hard to imagine people not knowing who Hilary Swank was. But that's really the trick, you know, is figuring out how do you balance all those, you know, the elements that make a movie makeable / commercial / you guys going to see it. I mean, that's the other thing you have to ask yourself. Like, I ask myself every day, what makes a movie theatrical? But what I really should do is just ask you, what makes you leave your home? You know, is it the actors? Is it the story? Is it the filmmaker? What makes you say, I'm going to leave my home, maybe pay for a babysitter, pay for us to go out to dinner? I don't know what movies cost here. In New York, they're up to, you know, $13 or $14. So what makes you say, I'll do that, rather than just wait till it comes on VOD, you know? Or even worse, just pirate it. You know, and that's the gazillion-dollar question right now.
Let's go in the corner over there.
You spoke about something that you're in production on right now. Is there anything, either what you're making or something else that you're excited about financing or trying to finance in the future?
Well, I have a couple movies that are going to start doing the festival circuit. Should I talk about those? 2 movies in particular. Or 3 movies in particular. One is called Goat, and it stars Ben Schnetzer and Nick Jonas. And it's based on a memoir by a writer named Brad Land. It's a fantastic script that was written by David Gordon Green like 10 years ago for us, that we finally got into production with a young director named Andrew Neal. It's about a terrible fraternity hazing, which, you know, now seems all the rage, terrible fraternity hazings. But it turned out really well. Scott's seen the promo, so he can vouch for that. And then another film called White Girl by a young director named Elizabeth Wood, that stars Morgan Saylor, Justin Barta, and Chris Noth. And it's basically, I'd say it's basically about gentrification, but in a very specific, authentic way that's almost reminiscent of Kids, you know, another movie we produced, but many, many years ago. So those are 2 movies that are going to start rolling out that I'm very excited about. And then we also produced Todd Solondz's latest movie, Wiener Dog, with Greta Gerwig, Danny DeVito. Oh, who else is in it? There's so many people. Ellen Burstyn, Zosha Mamet. It's a fantastic cast. I'm leaving tons of people out. But that turned out really well.
I'll ask another gazillion-dollar question because I get asked it all the time.
Okay.
And I'm kind of curious what your answer is, which is how all of the new sort of distribution platforms like Netflix, like my employer Amazon, are changing the way independent films are made or the way independent films will be seen. I mean, has that had much of an impact on how you feel you're doing business?
Absolutely, but I think it goes even back, I'd say in the past 10 years, we've had a true golden age of television, and a lot of people are sort of realizing like, whoa, I used to go to the art, I used to go to my local landmark theater to see movies with, difficult protagonists or ambiguous endings or, all of the, but now I'm just going to my television and I'm watching The Wire or Breaking Bad or what have you. So I think we've all noticed that like television has become less risk averse as the movies have become more risk averse. Meanwhile, I think people like me are starting to think, well, okay, we used to make movies, way back when we were making, the movies in the 90s, their only life was theatrical. That was it. They weren't even, even the ancillaries that existed weren't really, a movie like Poison wasn't going to do very well. Yeah. I mean, no, HBO wasn't going to buy Poison, but now when we're taking that idea, that script, and we're trying to decide, is this theatrical? What makes it theatrical? The answer might be, well, it isn't. It isn't theatrical, but it's still great. So let's take it to Amazon, or let's take it to, Amazon series, not your. We did a pilot for Amazon, which you should all watch. It's called Z, and vote yes for it.
Starring Christina Ricci as Zelda Fitzgerald.
Absolutely. But then we have all these other, also filmmakers come in, or I keep saying we have to stop calling ourselves filmmakers. We have to start saying storytellers, content makers. They come in to see me these days, and they're pretty savvy. They say, this is my theatrical film idea, but this is my web series idea. This is my long form idea. This is my episodic idea. So I think it's all starting to really blend together in a way that is just making a potent soup of content. And a lot of, I have a 16-year-old, and I think she's starting to be able to distinguish less and less between what the boundaries of content are, what makes a movie, what makes something a television movie. She just wants to watch the stories that speak to her, and she wants to watch them when she wants to watch them, and she doesn't want to pay for them. Like everybody else.
You seem to have your finger on the pulse of cultural currency, both historically and today. How do you think that, what do you think that the future is going to be like that you would kind of want to tap into and say, that's kind of culturally relevant?
God, I have no idea. And thank you for saying that. I don't know if I do at all. I always think it's like, we're just like, we're just running as fast as we can. I always say killer is, we've managed to stay alive for 20 years because we're like cockroaches after the nuclear blast. We'll eat plaster. We'll figure it out. I don't know. I feel more like I know it when I see it. Like I'm not I'm the great enabler. I see somebody who I think is really talented, and I figure out how to make that vision happen. But I guess my talent is having a pretty good eye that this idea, this methodology, whether they're 22 or 42 or 62, this thing they want to take from, you know, the script to whatever screen, whether it's the big screen or the little screen or the even littler screen, has some kind of relevancy. And that, I guess, is just something, you know, some kind of like sense of the zeitgeist. And I don't know how to put my finger on it.
And back there.
Hi. How do you decide to work with something that you really love and then go with it, instead of saying, I really love this and I want to keep it for myself and I don't want to hate it?
I don't
or
know
do
if
you
I've-
say, fuck it, and I'm going to make it because I want other
I've
people
never
to see
had
it?
any of those feelings except for the, like, I mean, keep it for my, I mean, you know, nobody makes movies except to show them to other people. That's kind of the fascinating thing about this particular art form. It's all about the audience. And even people like Todd, who you think, oh, you know, he's Mr. Art, you know, you think he doesn't care about the audience? He cares deeply. And if he didn't, he wouldn't be as good at what he does. You know, we showed Carol many, many times to different audiences, not for them to dictate what you saw on the screen at all, but to get a sense of their experience so that Todd could say, okay, this is the experience they're having. I'd like them to maybe have a slightly different experience, so I'm going to adjust the film in this way so that their experience will be this way or that way. I mean, that's what a great filmmaker does. A great filmmaker, I believe, completely takes his or her audience into account without being necessarily dictated by them, if that makes sense. You know, so I don't have any problem letting anything go. You know, I don't make anything for me. I make it for you.
And on that note, we have one little treat before we go. Because we had it queued up and it's such a beautiful 35 millimeter print, we will look at the clip of I'm Not There, which features the first appearance in the film of the star of Carol, Cate Blanchett, playing one of the many avatars of the unnamed Bob Dylan, this one called Jude Quinn.
Try my best to be just like I am, but everybody wants you to be just like them. They say sing while you slave and I just get bored, but I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no
Christine Vachon and the departed Todd Haynes, thank you so much.
Thank you.